declared a jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
We have focused our declaration of jihad on striking at the US soldiers inside Arabia. Even though American civilians are not targeted in our plan, they must leave. We do not guarantee their safety.
Mike, I am seeing more and more about heightened risk of terror attacks, and I'm getting more concerned that something could happen domestically, just like it did on 9/11. So I wanted you to talk to me a little bit about the rise of Al-Qaeda and whether or not something like that could happen again today. I know we learned a lot of lessons through 9/11, but I think it's important to understand the history of how we got to that point, because if I'm thinking about this correctly, there's a lot of tie-overs from what happened in the years leading up to that attack to what's going on now. So if it would be okay, I know you've studied this quite a bit, let's talk about the rise of Al-Qaeda, and you tell me, where do we start?
Absolutely. And just as you were pointing out, there's a lot of preconditions to what we saw before 9/11 as to what's happening today, but just most importantly, it's always the unknown unknowns that get us. But like I said, to get the full context of the story, we have to roll back the clock to 1978. So Afghanistan comes off the back of several civil wars and violent conflicts to establish the new form of government that's going to be there. Shortly thereafter, one of these parties that seizes power, again violently, is a communist party. And they immediately start seeking support from the USSR at the time. And this becomes critical because the USSR initially doesn't want to get involved, but a couple of years later does get involved to support this government and create a satellite, or allied client state, much like the US was doing during the Cold War at this time. And the reason why that these violent actions happen is because it really does piggyback off of World War I. And I know that's crazy, like you're saying, we're going to roll the clock back even further, but it's just an important detail, is things were never settled after post-World War I in a good way. There were a lot of Middle Eastern allies who supported the Allies in World War I who did not get the opportunity for self-determination and creating their own countries and governments that worked for them. So because of that weak governance, we saw many decades go by where they tried to sort that out across colonial and imperial, territorial lines. It leads us to 1978, where this just continues to keep boiling over, and Russia, or the USSR at the time, is the ones that says, we're going to go in and we're going to stabilize this area because the oil and that territory is important for the prestige of this country.
Now, when they say they're going to stabilize, does that mean when, like, the United States goes in and stabilizes a place, it's got some air quotes around it, right?
Absolutely. So it's the chief message that you always see from the general or leader of a country. It's going to be a short war. We're going to be in and out 6 months, maybe a year tops, and we're just going to rebuild this whole country and stabilize the situation. And again, there's a lot of commonalities between this conflict and what the U.S. Goes on later to do to try to fight in their war on terror. They're laying millions of landmines. They're using their air superiority to suppress both military but as well as civilian resistance, right? So this was perceived by many Afghanis, and again, this was a civil war, right? So many Afghanis perceive this as an invasion against their sovereignty and their right to rule their own country and maintain their own culture. So as much as there was a communist party in control, there were many other factions who opposed this kind of top-down management from a government far, far away.
So I get that there is a lot of mistrust and distress and kind of heightened tension throughout the Middle East following World War I. Now the Soviets have moved into Afghanistan. Okay, where does Osama Bin Laden come into this, and Al-Qaeda? Does Al-Qaeda even exist at this time yet?
So not yet, right? So we don't have Al-Qaeda, but we have this burgeoning jihad movement, and it's very clear to understand what jihad means. It simply means the struggle or a struggle, and it's not necessarily always violent, right? So it could be a jihad, a struggle to become a better Muslim, in the eyes of God, and to be an honorable person of good character. But it's around the 60s, 70s, and 80s that we start seeing a form of militant jihadism begin to foment. And not to throw too many names around, but there's a certain type of Salafi jihadism that emerges from it, and it's a lot of prominent scholars who are victims of this oppression in ways, but at the same time, they're promoting violent resistance against, disagreements with how government policies are orchestrated. And a lot of it is seen as either corruption by the West, and it's not quite just the U.S. at this time, because remember, we're coming off of World War II, so this includes France and the U.K., who had many of their colonies throughout North Africa and the Middle East, where these areas of tensions are going to build up. But what happens after that is it's perceived that all Western influence needs to be removed from the Middle East. It's the only way to obtain, some spiritual enlightenment in the eyes of, Allah in this specific instance in Islam. And it's quite problematic because it opposes things even like Arabian nationalism, where you might see things like Islamic republics that are built on some form of democracy or constitution or similar matters like that. So they're entirely opposed to those things, and it makes it quite difficult on a global stage when actors like that who want nothing to do with you are ready to oppose you in the most violent means. So now we need to come back down to Afghanistan specifically, right? So Osama bin Laden sees this as his call to action. This movement to resist foreign influence in Afghanistan and protect good Muslims there and the culture there is seen as, like I said, a call to action. It's part of the crusade. For them, the crusade has never ended. And Osama bin Laden has been influenced by many key thinkers at this time, and he's not quite the leader that he will be. But there's a key event that comes later in this Afghan civil conflict that does make him into the prominent leader that he is today. But this is where he gains all of his notoriety. This is where he hones a lot of his tactics, and he learns how to be a criminal organization leader. And there's a few key things that he does really well. It's the logistical support, it's the financial support, and then ultimately a spiritual backbone to this organization. So Osama bin Laden, while he did come from money, it is kind of a misunderstanding that he dumped lots and lots of money his whole life into this organization. That started that way, but a lot of his skills and his abilities come from his way to persuade other wealthy Muslims to donate to these organizations that could then funnel money back to what would eventually become Al-Qaeda. But this started as a resistance movement. So again, he gained a lot of notoriety amongst the civilians who opposed this as a stalwart defender of both Islam and Afghan sovereignty. So it seemed like an honorable mission at first. And now this is where America gets involved. And it's a common misconception as well that America created Al-Qaeda, we funded Osama bin Laden, and It's important to distinguish some key details here. The U.S. comes out of the Vietnam War after getting dragged into that, and we're kind of embarrassed, and we're on our back heel, and we're looking to do the same now to the USSR. We sense weakness. We sense a little bit of blood in the water. Their economic strains are really starting to show. And we see the Afghan country, it's known as the Graveyard of Empires, and when we're done with the story, you'll see exactly why. We were more than eager to get the USSR bogged down in Afghanistan. And an important note that I wanted to make was they had air superiority in the beginning. This was the USSR. So between helicopters and jet fighters, they were able to just pummel the resistance into submission, and quite brutally sometimes, because like I said, this extended to both military targets as well as civilian resistance targets. So even the people who were peacefully protesting were under the heel of the Afghan communist government at the time. So now what happens later is we see a big opportunity to really turn the tide of the war. So now the USSR relies heavily on this air superiority, and it's crucial just in all warfare, including today, to have that air superiority. It's what gives your troops on the ground the ability to conduct, potent actions, right?
I imagine the Afghanis have almost none of that.
So that's exactly what's going on. So they don't have anywhere near the number of equipment. They're fighting with Lee Enfield rifles. Again, that's probably just a random name to some, of our viewers here, but any military historians and geeks will know that this is a World War II era bolt-action rifle, right? So one you have to kind of load each round individually. They start the conflict like that, and it's been described as them beginning the conflict as patiently waiting for martyrdom, and then U.S. money starts rolling in. The CIA rolls in and says, we're going to fund the Mujahideen, which is the main organization that is opposing the Afghan government at the time. we're going to fund them, and not just enough to, be a stick in the eye for the USSR, but we want them to win. It's something on the order of like $4 billion is the first aid package that's given to, the CIA to distribute through there. And they're told, if this is not enough, we'll give you more. So this was really, America and foreign policy eager to strike a decisive blow through proxies to the USSR. And it was very, very successful. And the thing that really changed the tide of the war were these Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, right? So it's kind of that iconic over-the-shoulder mounted homing missile that could take out aircraft as well as helicopters. And the best time would be when they're landing or when they're taking off, right? So they're kind of a little distracted, and as well as they're exposed and don't quite have altitude to be able to do any kind of avoidance measures. And like I said, it's extraordinarily successful. This is how their military is bringing in the supplies and the reinforcements, right? So now they can't do that reliably when 1 out of every 4 helicopters is getting shot out of the air. The jets that are supposed to be there to provide air cover as well as support for your military actions can't engage safely, right? And for every one cheap missile that takes down a multi-million-dollar aircraft of some kind, the equation of whether this conflict is worth it or not changes rapidly. So like I said, this is a key difference here, though, is that the U.S. supported the Mujahideen, and some of those fighters would later join Al-Qaeda.
So there is some truth to the rumor, though, that maybe the CIA or we were funding separatist groups in order to thwart a foreign adversary like the USSR. But it does sound like, again, we see this time and time again in history. We don't necessarily care for the democratic rule of that nation state. We have the ability to send them money. I mean, it's interesting to hear just the fact that the United States was the one that supplied the terrorists with their iconic shoulder boom rocket. Like, that is what I picture when I think of a terrorist shooting down a helicopter. And it sounds like that's U.S. technology to upgrade their World War II era guns, which that's wild to me. And so there is some truth. I would push back to say it sounds like United States funded this in a way, and Osama's directly involved.
So he formed an organization known as the MAK. That's Osama Bin Laden's organization. That's where that would be the antecedents to what would become Al-Qaeda later, and it's what gives him the kind of practice to run an organization. So I don't want to completely, abdicate us of any responsibility going on there, because what happens is, right, we fund this group, but it creates an unstable country thereafter, right? So not that it's okay to necessarily let the USSR decides Afghan sovereignty for them, but it's not like the conditions were vastly improved afterwards. All we were concerned about was making sure that the USSR lost. And like I said, the USSR, the way they conducted their war would be to destroy sometimes villages if they were in the way, or whole roads and infrastructure because it was too dangerous for troops to pass. It's unfortunate that that's something that the U.S. would later do, because they realized what a difficult region of the world this is to fight in. And when you're fighting asymmetric warfare, how difficult that truly is, that you can't even cross what was, secure property or ground from time ago, right?
Yeah. Well, very interesting. So, okay, we've helped fund the Mujahideen. We've helped rise these Soviets, these Afghani separatists to defeat the Soviets. Is there any prominent battles or anything like a story that is hailed as, wow, Osama Bin Laden, you saved us, you're our guy? When did that happen?
Absolutely. So then we come to the Battle of Jaji in 1987. And this is the battle that galvanizes Osama bin Laden. Now, he's known as he's at a compound of his own design and his choice of location, and it's not quite the most military, strategic, or tactically advantageous position. However, it is an ideologically important position because it seems like a tip of the spear if Afghan communist government and USSR forces want to control a region or provide stability in that area. They're going to have to deal with this fortification, and like I said, it's quite exposed, and it's not strategically an ideal position. So the USSR and the Afghan communist government do come along one day to decide, all right, we're gonna remove this threat from the area and then proceed to the rest of the region. And they begin shelling and bombing this location for many, many days. And like I said, this was of Osama bin Laden's design. So now he's there with some of his early ragtag fighters and his militia that he has there. And they're just taking a devastating shelling and quite significant casualties. But they hold out for days against this, napalm, high explosive ordnances, mortar positions, tank shelling, all these things. They hold out for several days. And what's quite interesting is every time that the USSR and the Afghan forces try to make some advance, they do get repelled. So it's seen as this courageous battle, and they manage to hold off long enough for some of their other forces from the actual other separatist groups, not specifically what would eventually be the Al-Qaeda or Osama bin Laden's fighters, but some of his other allies would surround the USSR and Afghan communist forces and would put a ton of pressure on them. They actually managed to slip through the mountainsides, and it's like I said, truth is stranger than fiction sometimes, right? This is almost like a Tom Clancy novel. They managed to surround the special forces, the Spetsnaz, and drive them back. And had the Spetsnaz known that there were only a handful of fighters left in the compound,
Right.
they probably could have put Osama bin Laden down that day, and his story would be over, and he would just be, another martyr on the battle. But because they withdraw from that, it is seen as this galvanizing and lionizing event. Osama bin Laden becomes this hero, and it was his idea to hold out here. And another critical piece of context is later in 1987, the USSR would decide that they're going to withdraw from that year. So it's been 1978 to 87, and they've gotten little accomplished. They're coming up on their 10-year anniversary on the war, and it's costing them a tremendous amount of money. And for every helicopter they put in the air that gets taken out by a Stinger missile, they're losing money that they can't afford. So the writing's on the wall, and they decide it's time to leave. But it's timed just well enough for Osama bin Laden to capitalize on this as propaganda to say, look, we defeated them at the Battle of Jaji, and we're turning around, one of the largest superpowers in the world. They came here and they tried to fight us, but through Allah and our beliefs, we were able to push them back. So, like I said, this is a critical juncture in Osama bin Laden's life. And after this, they start getting thousands of volunteers to their organization. So it's not just some local little myth. It spreads quite quickly across the Arabic region.
Makes a lot of sense, because it doesn't sound like he has this vast military or strategic experience. In fact, they almost basically lost the war in that very battle where he existed in that building, it sounds like.
Right.
But then he was able to use the propaganda powers and the religious powers that he did have, or financial backing, to become the triple threat that he did. And it sounds like that distrust that was sown from the West throughout history, essentially, in the Middle East, has now pushed these folks to become radicalized even further. Whether it's against the Soviets, against the United States, it doesn't actually matter to the folks in the Middle East. They're just trying to protect their Muslim statehood and their fundamental values that they believe in, which in this case is rooting out the foreigner values that are go against Muslim. But that's what they believed at the time. So, okay, wow. So they use this to their ability, the propaganda, to cement Osama's military might, essentially, develop this ragtag crew of now up to thousands, and they're still in Afghanistan. I know that Osama's from Saudi Arabia, so where do they go after, where do they set up camp, essentially, to start developing their operations?
Sure. So this becomes the next crucial part of the story. So I do want to encapsulate some of the things that you were talking about in an example, right? So now we're coming up to the Gulf War, right, real soon. And then the Gulf War takes place on the Iraq-Kuwait border. This was a challenge to Kuwaiti sovereignty. And again, to highlight something, Iraq at the time, Saddam Hussein was the pinnacle of Arabian nationalism, right? So he was kind of antithetical to this jihadi, a movement that was forming that believed in kind of an Islamic caliphate, right? So he was not an Islamic, leader through and through. He was a secular generalissimo kind of character, right? So you have Saddam Hussein invading Kuwait over disputes over oil fields and kind of their property lines, right? So what happens is Saudi Arabia becomes incredibly concerned that Iraq is going to destabilize the whole region and that they might be next. Saddam Hussein presented a threat, and Osama bin Laden saw this as one of his key opportunities now. He just starts forming what would become the organization that we know as Al-Qaeda. He sees this as another opportunity to defend Arabia. And for people who don't know, I'm not an Islamic scholar, so I understand completely. This is something I learned, that how important Saudi Arabia it is, the Arabian continent is to Muslims. So it's kind of belief by fundamentalist Muslims that it is blasphemy for foreigners to set foot on that land.
Oh,
Osama bin Laden, like I said, takes this opportunity to look at Saddam Hussein as the threat in this region. And he goes to Saudi Arabia and he says, I have 10,000 fighters. I would like to stand on behalf of Saudi Arabia and put the resistance movement against Saddam Hussein. Saudi Arabia at the time looks at this ragtag army when they have other allies like the United States, the other preeminent superpower in the world. They watch them just kind of defeat the USSR, and they look at the US and all the money that they gave to the Mujahideen in that area, and they just said, yeah, I'd rather go with the U.S. support because they're just going to probably win this war a lot faster than you can, than a decade-long, resistance movement. And for people who don't remember, the Gulf War was fairly quick and decisive and actually speaks to one of the last instances of our foreign policy really going well, where we didn't destabilize a whole region, we didn't remove Saddam Hussein from power, but we just kind of restored the status quo and we withdrew from the region. But this was key because Saudi Arabia slighting or the perceived slight to Osama bin Laden would make him resent the United States, and seeing United States troops and eventually NATO and other UN troops on the ground, he would see this as blasphemy that would go on to fuel the rest of his attacks, right? Or inspirations for these attacks. So like I said, this takes us to the early 90s, and he gets kicked out of Saudi Arabia, gets his passport revoked, and he goes to Sudan for a little while. And that's where the story goes on there, where he kind of gets dumped off in Sudan because the U.S. at the time doesn't have any means, like legal, evidence or a case built against them to really detain him. This is pre 9/11. Post 9/11, our ability to prosecute terrorists and use global terror acts as means for detaining them changes, right? So before this, we don't have those. Right. So he slips off into Sudan for a little while. He uses his connections from his family's construction companies, and he starts doing similar things to what he did in Afghanistan as trying to build up the Islamic government, the front that is in Sudan at the time.
Right. So this is now when he's developing, if I recall, like training camps and developing what is now Al-Qaeda. So how large is he able to grow the forces, and what is the plan at that time? I mean, throughout the 90s, what is their goal? Just to root out more Americans and the Westerners from Muslim countries?
Right. So there's a lot of attacks that they're planning, and this is what makes it so interesting, is that it's a very difficult organization to follow as the history goes on because they decentralize themselves. So while Osama bin Laden and a few key figures at the top are the ones that are, giving the go-ahead and support and resources for certain missions, and they might, decide, have a little creative control, it really is ultimately up to these decentralized cells on the ground. So one of the first really nasty attacks, and I'm going to pull up just some statistics so I don't misquote anything here. We have the World Trade Center bombing that goes on in 1993, and this shakes the world because it's kind of something that no one really thought was possible for a long time. A lot of terrorist attacks didn't happen anywhere near this scope, and it only is with hindsight do we realize how devastatingly close that they were to taking down the World Trade Center.
At that time.
There may have been, there were only 6 fatalities, but there were over 1,000 individuals who were injured. And had they placed the explosives in the basement correctly, they would have most likely took down one tower and caused it to fall into the other. That was their end goal. This was a scope of terror that the world had not seen before. And unfortunately, we were getting lots of threats and things like this going on. This has Al-Qaeda's, I don't want to say fingerprints on it, but Al-Qaeda is loosely tied to this, but most importantly, figures who would later become very important in the Al-Qaeda organization. The 93 bombing is done by Ramzi Youssef, and he is the nephew who would become nephew to someone who would become number 2 in the Al-Qaeda organization and essentially Osama bin Laden's right-hand man.
So it certainly curried a lot of favor for the Al-Qaeda when they saw what these guys were able to accomplish, and on domestic soil, might I add.
Absolutely. This was extremely emboldening to them and what they could do. And unfortunately, we did have many responses of some kind throughout the years. They were never in significant impact to disrupt the organization. So, there's so many instances that we could go through where it just seems like sand slips through your hands of all these pieces of evidence from 1990 to 2001, September 11th, where there were warnings about it. But it's always easy in hindsight to kind of draw the picture, but it almost just infuriates you because there just seems to be so many warnings about this, right? I mean, they're telling you what their grand designs were to do this. And I think there's this really crazy quote when Ramzi Yousef is being hauled off after he's arrested in a helicopter. FBI agents are showing him, look, the Twin Towers, they're still standing, so you couldn't do it, something along those lines. And he's like, if I had enough explosives and I had enough money, I would have. And we would come to later find out that that's what they would actively try to do from that point forward, right? So Osama bin Laden's in Sudan at this point, up until 1996. And like I said, Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda don't directly plot this attack. They don't, have their hands on it directly, but they're financiers. And this is really the missteps of the intelligence community is they keep seeing Osama bin Laden as just a supporter of terrorism and not realizing that, he is the linchpin in a lot of these cells and their ability to conduct these attacks. So the World Trade Center bombing is just the beginning of it. I mean, there's several other attacks we could go into that involve, on Saudi Arabian soil, U.S. forces in front of it, like a National Guard base, and aspects like that. But they're just really smaller pieces in some of these larger ones, because to jump the story forward a little bit, we kick Osama bin Laden out of Sudan by pressuring the government to tell them, we want him out of there, otherwise, we're going to do something about it. But again, we don't have the means to detain him or anything, so where do we send him afterwards? Okay, he has no Saudi Arabian passport, so we're going to kick him out of Sudan. Let's plug him in Afghanistan. That's so far away. What could he possibly do from over there? And boy, was that another misstep in this whole picture.
Just question,
because
how do we have the right to tell him where to go to Afghanistan? Do we, because he's an international criminal, we extradited him, or what would be the process for that?
So that's the thing is, right, so we're pressuring the Sudan government at the time saying, either sanctions or ultimately could be, special forces and military actions, like we could launch cruise missiles over, etc., and attack primary targets, just all these different diplomatic threats, either, with a big stick or actually using the stick sometimes we do. And we pressured him to leave from there, and it's kind of on the grounds of, hey, listen, he's planning terror attacks. If you don't do something about it soon, we're going to consider you an accomplice. We're putting you on notice. Yeah. And, that's the U.S.'s kind of stance on that, and many countries do this as well. And we do this after 9/11, right? This is kind of like, if you're not going to cooperate with us and you're going to provide safe haven to them, then we're going to do something about that, right? And it could include different actions of kinds.
Or like the Iran sanctions that we've seen that recently were lifted, actually. Interesting. All right. Well, hey, listen, let's keep going, because you mentioned there were multiple other ones. I know that when September 11th happened in 2001, we were younger. We were still in grade school. And I remember being confused, like, wait a minute, there was another bombing on the World Trade Center previous to this one?
Right.
So it's very interesting. You're telling me now that they attacked domestic soil. They were successful in creating mass havoc and damage and getting their message across, but they weren't successful in the extent of the damage or destruction they wanted to cause. And as he's being hauled away, as you share, they literally are saying, we are going to do this again. We know we could have done more, and we will do more. It almost seems like a promise. So did they do more?
Yeah, so let's flash forward the story to 1998, and this is the embassy bombings, and this really speaks to the advancements and the sophistication of the organization and their ability to conduct simultaneous attacks in different locations around the world, right? So we have Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar al-Assam, Tanzania were the targets of it. They were only able to hit 2 of those locations. But to speak to those casualties, it was substantial, right? There were 213 people killed, including 12 Americans there, and over 4,000 people were injured in Nairobi. That was the Nairobi incident. Dar es-Salaam, they were able to kill 11 people and injure another 85. So thankfully, the other embassy attack did not go off as planned, because as you could see, if all 3 of these had went off to the extent that they had hoped, I mean, they were talking thousands of casualties, right? This is not... These weren't simple protests. These weren't targeting some military actors and maybe even high-level people. These are lots of civilians, right? They might, you could say, are cogs in the history, and they're supporting this, American embassy in that location. But, they're just folks like you and I. They have a degree in foreign policy, or they know the country really well, and they want to, establish good communication from them, and they go out and they suit up and they go to their job every day. And it's the kind of stuff that sticks with you, right? This is their whole goal. It's a terror campaign. It's to make you fearful. And to the intelligence community, it made the handful of actors who were paying attention extremely fearful. But this message from the handful of actors never reaches to the top. And I'm talking presidential administrations, be it Clinton or eventually Bush. It never makes it to the top in a decisive manner that they change their policies and act on it. There were lots and lots of warnings, but we had a very little budget and very few people actually following this, and lots of personalities about, this is my agency's case and my intelligence, and about disclosing and sharing it between these agencies. So it really speaks to the failure, like I said, of several presidential administrations to see this threat for what it was. You have another problem with this, right? So these embassy bombings are significant. It raises Bill Clinton's alert, but we're going into a lot of political scandals that are going on around this time, right?
Right, exactly. Monica Lewinsky, okay.
Right, so it's the Monica Lewinsky scandal that distracts them from, really a decisive counterterrorism strategy in response to this and recognizing, they claim to understand the threat that he was, and saying to the following administration, the Bush administration, one of my biggest regrets was never to get Osama Bin Laden for you, and I'm sorry, but it's like, this is all stuff in hindsight, and it's like, yeah, that might have been a passing memo, but there was no policy change, there was no funding increases that would have allowed our intelligence agency to have more resources to do stuff about this, right? At the end of the day, it's like
lip service.
A handful of people. Yeah, it's a handful of people who are following Osama Bin Laden, and they only have so many hours that they're alive in a day to be able to do things, so after the embassy bombings, we really fail to recognize the sophistication that's growing. And I don't want to keep rambling, but there's one really big plot arc that I need to include here. In the early Philippines, we're able to capture a few people and other cells, and they're talking about this Bojinga plot. And in a plot that is multi-stage and even includes the assassination of the Pope while he's on a foreign visit. And part of this is, this Bojinga plot is using planes as missiles and filling them with bombs and crashing to them in very important targets. Many important targets in the United States that include the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, the White House, right? These are all things that the groundwork was laid. And now these were cells that were disrupted in the early 90s, but it speaks to their dedication, because many sources would later say that this Bojinka plot would just become a refined version that would then become the planes operation that is 9/11.
It's remarkable to think about how you could tie these strings together and watch it all happen in hindsight. And I mean, I know that you've dived, and anyone who's listening can tell how versed you are in this, dived into the data, dived into these books. Most importantly, though, parse through that 9/11 Commission report, right, to go through the failures that we experienced. And heck, it's been very well documented, I guess, but it was only documented in hindsight, and that's what's really frightening about all of this. And that's actually what spawned this whole conversation. Is just last week, they're telling us now that there's an increased, or actually elevated was the word they used, elevated risk of terror on foreign embassies, or on United States embassies abroad. And that is exactly, it sounds like exactly what happened here. When you couple that with the open border situation that we've had for the past couple of years, I think that's settled a little bit now, but it's been confirmed. People on terror watch lists are pouring into the country. So let's think about this. We have foreign threats against U.S. embassies, specifically stated by Islamic terrorist groups. Then we have known terrorist organizers and executors coming over the southern border, and they're not accounted for. They're not being tracked in that way. We just know about it. And presumably, these organizations are still running. The Taliban runs Afghanistan. Hezbollah is stronger than ever. And we have to imagine these people in the United States are being funded. So as we see in Nairobi, Kenya, as we see in these other attacks, it takes a very small number of people to make something very devastating happen. And all of these cards are falling in the exact same way that we've witnessed before. So in later episodes, just so everyone's aware, we are going to get into more of the intelligence failures, but we still need to understand what happened leading up to this attack. And it sounds like all of the hallmarks are still there. So yeah,
exactly,
Mike,
right?
Make me feel better, please.
No, unfortunately, I'm not going for a little bit. The story has to get worse before it gets better. And when we're all done with this, we're absolutely going to do a synthesis episode and kind of see, where do we go moving forward. But there's some point I really wanted to circle back on that you spoke about, and it speaks to the asymmetry, right? Is it only takes a handful of individuals to engage in really awful attacks. I mean, we could talk about some later attacks, right? It could just be even a lone gunman could really cause terror and some really heinous damage to our societal way of life, but also people's personal lives, right? So speaking to the asymmetry, right? Well, we're going to go down to the 2000 USS Cole bombing, right? And this was just an attack that was conducted by two individuals. Obviously, some other organization around it, Al-Qaeda, that's providing the financing and the means to do it. But it also speaks to the dedication, because not too long before this attack goes off, they tried a similar attack. It failed. It was warned about but unrecognized. I mean, a boat filled with explosives sank, and they were able to recover the explosives and prep the second boat. Now, what happens in the USS Cole bombing is it's two, maybe three individuals in a very small skiff, which is a very tiny fishing boat. Fits about 3 to 5 people. It's, like I said, very small in scope. And it's packed with explosives, and it crashes in the side of a destroyer, and it kills 17 Americans and injures hundreds more. And it's simply devastating, because where they attack in the midship line is the cafeteria area, right? So this is, again, a bunch of sailors who are just cogs in the gear of history, right? They're not policymakers. They're just doing their duty. They're told to run the ship, and they're just eating their lunch or breakfast at the time. And an explosion in the midship, kills 17 of them instantly, or 11 or so instantly, and a few more succumb to their injuries over the days. And this is millions and millions of dollars of damage, probably done for, a couple $10,000 worth of damage. But most importantly, it's a strike at our prestige and the visage that we're invincible, right? This emboldens your enemies, and it would lead to a frustration by the Bush administration saying, I'm tired of swatting flies, but many times we would launch cruise missiles at training camps or sites for where Al-Qaeda is operating, and it doesn't cost most to set up these sites, right? You're talking maybe a couple $100,000 it cost to them, but that cruise missile was millions of dollars, and we launched several of them at this, right? And then it took the cost of the standing military to do it. But by not responding and trying to constantly disrupt these organizations, it could just take a couple people in a boat to enact massive damage.
Yeah.
And as we would later see, will only take 19, and maybe there was a 20th hijacker, it would only take 20 hijackers to wrought the terror that we saw coming, September 11th in our story in 2001.
Wow. So it's a testament to how powerful our intelligence community has to be, and how beefed up it really does have to be. It's just such an important conversation, especially as we go through policies now where many on the right, and I'll admit it, and I'm one of them, say we need to lessen the powers of our intelligence agencies, especially after they go after American citizens. Now, what they do to foreign is very important, and it comes back to some conversations we've had in the past about the FISA court and how they operate. And listening to you right now, I will admit there's no doubt we need this infrastructure. We need the ability to spy on these foreign targets, and our ability to do it. But it does sound like we just were totally insufficient at that time. And can you talk a little bit more about the infighting between the FBI or the CIA, or however, why weren't they able to talk? That doesn't really jive for me.
Absolutely, right? So this speaks to a lot of pride and hubris, right? People defending the honor of their organization and their turf, and this is their investigation and things like that. We had a lot of instances that separate different components, even within the FBI or within the CIA, never really getting a message that was strong enough to the actual policymakers, right? Like the president and his advisors, never really getting a message enough that's convincing to them. And like I said, sometimes it's even intra-organization issues. We're thwarting plots. In 1990, we have the Jordanian Millennium Plot. We have the Strasbourg Cathedral plot that's thwarted, and that's between 99 and 2000. And these all speak to very highly sophisticated cells, that are operating. And we never connect the dots, is that they're all Al-Qaeda, and they're all receiving kind of training from this one area. Like, maybe we should do something about this one area and organization that they're receiving, training from. To go back to also what you said, is this porous border situation, just because I'm a guy in the left of center, just because I'm adamantly pro-immigration, doesn't mean I, approve of the humanitarian crisis that we have. Because besides speaking to the terror, which I'll get into in a moment, it is a humanitarian crisis. The things that people have to go through, the things that happen to them, and what they have to do to get across the border.
100%.
So just before you include all of those other things, right? it creates terrible preconditions for allowing, as you said, individuals who are on terror watch lists to infiltrate a country. This is problems that were discovered after the fact. Unfortunately, the CIA, tracking some of these individuals, watching them go to Kuala Lumpur and Malaya to this terrorist organization, and then losing track of them afterwards, and losing track of them after they get inside the United States. Many of these individuals, who would soon be the 19 hijackers on the flights, use their own names.
Yeah.
They didn't even bother trying to use alter aliases and cover identities and things like that. In fact, 2 of them were known watch list targets, and nothing was done to follow up on them, in the entire year that they were floating around. And sometimes these other hijackers would leave the United States and come back. And you have reports of very fishy things, like a bunch of, Arabs going to these far-flung flight schools, and it's like we have this record number of emails from, organizations trying to send people from Afghanistan for flight training in the United States and requesting visas for them. And again, it seems like it's all 2020 hindsight, but there's just so many friggin' warnings that are being given, memos, documents that are being passed along, and it's because it's only like a handful of people who are doing all these analysis. Maybe it's not seen as important, but the people who are on the Bin Laden team, they're screaming, they're pulling their hair out. I do want to go over a lot of incidences, and I'll focus on the CIA before we get to the FBI. But the CIA, if you watch the show Looming Tower and also read the book, which I would highly recommend, they do a pretty good job of balancing dramatization but also telling most of the key points of the story. So what I really liked about it was they showed how there were the ALEC team, as they were known, the handful of individuals who were tracking Al-Qaeda and Osama Bin Laden. If anything, they wanted to go too hard, right? They wanted to just throw the spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks, kind of thing. They were like, we have to just send troops in. Like, we'll send special forces and we'll coordinate with, resistance movements on the ground who don't approve of Osama Bin Laden operating there, right? And we'll just send them in, and if it fails, it doesn't matter. A 50% chance is better than doing nothing and letting these things go on. The story evolves a little bit. The Predator drone technology starts to come online, and the ability for able to get reconnaissance and real-time information. Because again, this was the key, is right. Yeah. We're coming into a new era where battlefield intelligence is evolving. It's now you don't have to worry just about human intelligence. It's people on the ground trying to get you, good data about where this guy Osama Bin Laden actually is,
which is impossible,
and giving you the confirmation in real time, right? These Predator drones now could fly relatively undetected. And then the conversations quickly evolved to, like, what if we put an anti-tank missile on that thing and try to target Osama bin Laden when we see him at one of these camps, right? Like, we should do something. So you have incidences going all the way back to Sudan. We push him out of there. You have Jalalabad in Afghanistan in 98. You have Kandahar, Afghanistan in 98. Khost in 99 in Afghanistan, Herat in Afghanistan in 99, the Tarnak farms in Afghanistan in 2000. These are various different instances pre-Predator drones where we have good intel but not great intel.
But we don't strike. And it really does, it makes you really question your rationale and logic, right? The whole reason why these weren't conducted was because of the high rate of potential collateral damage, right? Just other individuals in the camps, be it wives and children who may not necessarily support this cause, but they're just, like I said, the wives and children of these fighters who live on these camps and things like that. What would it do to U.S. foreign policy and optics to, miss Osama bin Laden and kill 100 wives and children and just innocent people, there, right? That was a legitimate concern. But you look at this war on terror that we fought, how many innocent lives, both, on the U.S. and Arabs around the world in these areas who are just cogs caught in the gears of history, right? What were those potential 50 to 100 people that might have been accidentally killed? But you got Osama bin Laden, the mastermind and financier behind all these plots, and you prevented this war on terror. Wouldn't that have been worth it, right? Yeah. And the story doesn't stop there, because all through 2000 to 2001, we have more Predator drone information coming online. There was a kind of a unique story where they were able to scramble some MiG jets, which are a type of Soviet fighters that the Taliban had at the time, and they're providing refuge for Al-Qaeda at this time. They were able to scramble them in the air, so we've become a little hesitant to launch our Predator drones anymore for fear of them getting shot down. But again, it's like the price of a couple Predator drones and preventing the war on terror. It almost seems like a no-brainer. All of these Patriot Act
FISA court, rulings, all of these things that are questionable decisions that really challenge what we hold dear as part of our privacy and whatnot. This is all emergent of that, and we never really had a conversation, because once 9/11 happens, everyone is all gung-ho. We have to take care of this threat kind of situation. Yeah. If you're standing in the way of intelligence gathering, you're helping the enemy. Do you want the terrorists to win? So again, staring into the abyss, the abyss stares back into you, and we start getting rid of some of these civil liberties and freedoms that we as Americans hold dear.
It sounds like after the attack happened, we went nuclear, as George Bush would put it, or nuclear as we might. But I think that actually is a good word that I chose, nuclear, because that was what happened in World War II, and we had what maybe many critics would describe it as a disparate response. Ours was disproportionate to the bombing on Pearl Harbor, or the attack, I should say. And what that makes me think of is 2 weeks ago, we interviewed an Israeli citizen, Matan. Shout out Matan. Thank you for coming on. But we asked him a very specific question, is how does he respond to the same criticisms that the Israeli government is now responding in a disproportionate way to the terrorist attacks that happened on their homeland? So it's very interesting. Of course, you could argue the merits of both sides of that, but at this time, what I'm interested in is interesting. We were worried about collateral damage, likely because of the lessons we learned in World War II or the egg that we had on our face, and now we're refusing to act to save tens of thousands of lives only because of some collateral damage that may incur on a terrorist base camp. To me, it sounds like poor understanding, but again, we're operating here on hindsight is 2020. So now when we look at all of what this happened and to think about, could this happen again today? Well, we don't have the benefit of hindsight anymore. So I'm curious if we were to go and again, we're observing Hezbollah, we're observing the Taliban, but under the Biden presidency and actually under the Trump as well, we pulled out of Afghanistan, which let the Taliban run rampant. And we now under Biden have forgiven Iran and given them their money that we've frozen and lifted the sanctions. So what's very interesting is not only are we not striking due to the potential for collateral damage, we're reversing these policies. And oh my God, Mike, you were right. You didn't make me feel better here. So please make me feel better.
Sure. So the U.S. intelligence community is a much more advanced and stalwart defender of America than it was pre-9/11. I can assure you that. I mean, fortunately or unfortunately, however you want to look at it, budgets quadrupled, quintupled, resources were added, but we still need to refine our policy. We're doing the post-mortem of our war on terror, and there's a lot of things that we should have learned from previous conflicts, or we should have learned along the 2 decades while we were conducting it, but we didn't. And I don't want to make you feel bad, but I will at least just tell you that there are hardworking men and women on this who are trying to figure out how do we go forward on the policies that make America safer. We can criticize foreign aid and international aid and things like this, but they're a key component of this strategy, right? Is America can't be the police force everywhere. We are a preeminent superpower. We have a large role to play in that, but this can't be just the U.S. alone. Diving back into some other intelligence failures, we had lots of countries, the UK, Germany specifically, many others, handing us a lot of intel at the time, which we now realize was very good intel and were credible warnings. And then you see other countries, far-flung areas around the world, be it the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and we regard their intelligence communities as unreliable. But then there were some times where a broken clock was right twice a day, and there were amazingly credible pieces of information that now we look back at. If we had just paid attention to, we could have either disrupted or delayed the plot to 9/11 and maybe scaled it back, and it might not have been horrific as it was. And the only way that could get done is by improving those resources on the ground and somehow building some trust between these nations, Yeah. So we make bedfellows with countries that we don't necessarily share the same values with, but one of those values is to try to put a stop on terror warnings. Yeah. And again, I don't want to make you feel worse. And while we are distracted all around the world in many different conflicts, so that's one of the preconditions that does concern me, right? Is there's conflicts happening on the Ukraine-Russia border and in Israel and Gaza that are huge distractions. A lot of our attention is also drawn towards the South China Sea and China raising its escalation and tensions in the region there. And that might seem like a completely divided intelligence community, but there is still counterterrorism divisions that are solely focused on this.
There's an interesting dichotomy because every conflict you just listed, right, what do they have in common? Those are nation states. Those are countries, just like the United States of America. But when you talk about terror cells of just a few people in many cases, I mean, you're not going to war with a country. And that's, I know I've heard the term war on terror. I mean, did I just describe it like that? It's not a war on a country. It's a war on a terror organization. Is that literally what it means?
So pre-2001, our entire intelligence community apparatus was designed to win a Cold War. There had been some modest changes, to recognize the emerging new threats, but certainly not a coherent counterterrorism strategy that we saw post 9/11. In fact, right, we have the Counterterrorism Center, right, that has all these agencies come together and collaborate. The FBI before this time was an entirely decentralized organization. The Minnesota headquarters did Minnesota headquarters things that they thought Minnesota headquarters felt was important, and that was their priorities. And the central FBI really, didn't have that top-down influence to tell them what to do or even communicate ongoing investigations that they had that might be pertinent to that. And the reason why I bring up that specific case is because of the Zacarias Moussaoui arrest and trial, right? So there's some belief that he might have been the 20th hijacker, and at the very least he was an independent cell that had his own plans going on. A major failure was when he was arrested, his computer was detained as evidence, and the Minnesota office had requested, I think, at least 20 times to get a hold of that evidence, to review that computer from FBI headquarters, because they believed that there might be more there, and there was probably evidence on there that would have directly linked him to the Al-Qaeda camps in Afghanistan that he received training from. And while he wasn't exactly part of the plot, it seems, from the planes operation, he knew many of the key individuals, received training, and could have identified them. And this probably would have been the logjam for many intelligence communities to tie together. And that's something that changes dramatically after 2001. Again, we can have lots and lots of criticisms about before and what is the hallmark of what has made Western civilization so successful so far, and every time we fail is because we fail to not heed these values, is to look back with, no holds barred evaluation and assessment of how we messed up and what we could do to be better. And the commission report and many other things were very good tools and resources for that, but there are still many things that we're falling short of, that's for sure.
Yeah, well, it's difficult for a country like the United States as a whole to separate their ego from the situation and kind of objectively review how they acted or didn't act, because they want to maintain their supremacy. They want to maintain their imperial rule on the country. So we're like, in history, we're really, really close. We're approaching the attacks of 9/11, or after there. But leading up to it, I don't want to put my tinfoil hat on today, but there are many claims that people kind of not only knew that an attack was coming, but knew, like, directly this attack was coming. They knew it was going to involve planes. They knew it was going to involve a big building. I mean, obviously there was a hint of the World Trade Centers being attacked in 1993. So is there any concrete evidence that was just flat out ignored that said they're going to attack? And is that possible that it got out to some people in the alternative media to say, wow, we're looking at this, this may happen? Is there anything that's like that, like kind of a smoking gun?
So there is this presidential daily brief that occurs on August 6, 2001 that makes for a very compelling audio bite later by Condoleezza Rice, because, again, everyone claims, especially within the Bush administration, that it's hindsight's 2020. We were receiving lots and lots of threats, and it was hard to figure out which ones were the credible ones. And it's this one, and they got her to repeat it on air, she clearly was familiar with this document. Bin Laden determined to strike in the U.S. And this is an explicit warning. This is a presidential daily briefing that was given to George W. Bush, right? So this is, again, you can't say, oh, it, disseminated through a bunch of principals and never quite made it up to, Bush's ears. This is something that was brought directly to his attention, but it was this general idea of, we're tired of swatting flies. That was something that he was quoted as saying. And, you understand the rationale. I'm tired of throwing millions of dollars of American taxpayers' money at burlap tents, in the desert somewhere, and all of a sudden the camp pops up again. But it really speaks to this asymmetric warfare that we've entered. I really like this line from, I forget the name of the gangster movie. I believe it was the John Dillinger movie with Johnny Depp. And, the police are always talking about how criminals, these bank robbers, they have to get lucky every time. Us law enforcement, we just have to get lucky once and we'll catch them. Asymmetric suicide terrorists only have to get lucky once.
That's true.
Every failed plot is not mutually exclusive of their ability to try to conduct more, especially when these are decentralized cells. So one of these things is we have to have at least an honest conversation about what our intelligence community can do, what we're comfortable with the information they collect. We need to have an honest conversation about the immigration crisis, and that's what it is. It's a crisis. It's both humanitarian and a national security crisis, and we can go into deeper conversations about, other implications, but these are all preconditions that we need to work on, and as a country, we need to do it together because it looks like our political leaders are a little unfocused. There's a lot of domestic policy that they're dealing with and not enough foreign policy that they need to make Americans aware of so we could be participants in that conversation. Otherwise, it's just going to be executive orders again, and we'll be, 20 years later writing another postmortem.
Yeah, of a multi-trillion-dollar war that accomplished nothing because it wouldn't be the second or the third time even for our country. Well, Mike, I know, and it's very obvious from this conversation how many dozens of, maybe even hundreds of hours you've put in studying this stuff, and I'm very grateful for it. And so our viewers are aware. I am legitimately concerned about this topic. That's why I asked Mike to go dive into this, because I know he also has dived into it every year in the past. And actually, Mike, we featured a guest recently on a climate change episode because that's what he does. Carbon capture, study, and manufacturing these devices. That's what his area of expertise is. But he, like you, is also kind of an encyclopedia on 9/11 attacks and what led up to it. And more, actually, his wheelhouse is the attack itself. So what we decided, and so our viewers can prepare, is this is part one of a potentially 4-part series where the next episode we're going to feature what happened during the attack. Exactly how they got through the airport security, exactly how they boarded the plane, overtook those planes, and carried out this attack, as well as some of the aftermath that did occur. So it will definitely be a heavy episode. This was a heavy episode as well, but definitely was necessary to set the stage on how this group came to be, the rise to power of Osama Bin Laden. And by the way, Mike, I noticed you were saying Osama Bin Laden, or if I read some of these reports, it says UBL. What's the difference between UBL and OBL? Is there any?
Sure. So Osama bin Laden was his original moniker and name, and then you had kind of an amalgamation. I think you referenced it earlier. Yeah, the media kind of used Osama, more phonetic spelling of his name, but UBL is how he was originally referred to in all these intelligence documents for a couple decades while they were tracking him.
Interesting. It reminds me of when I was growing up. I always referred to the capital of Ukraine as Kiev, and now we call it Kyiv because the media wanted to set that narrative that way, which maybe is better. Yeah. But anyway, Mike, no, seriously, grateful for this. You have not made me feel better, and you have not made our listeners feel better, but you've absolutely informed them. Is there anything else you want to leave us with before we head into the next episode that we're going to do?
A forewarning. It's going to be a heavy episode. I don't want to, it's not to turn you away. You need to be upset. You need to be angry. It's important to realize, as we come on 23rd anniversary of September 11th soon, it is just as relevant as ever. Those wounds, those emotional scars, they're just as relevant as ever. You and I know a couple people personally. There's someone in our fraternity, unfortunately, who's succumbed to these attacks. When you live in the Northeast, there's almost nobody who wasn't touched by this if they were a certain age at the time. Yeah. But we're approaching a really crucial juncture in history where the generation that's turning into adults now have zero memory of this event.
That's a great point.
And if you are upset about foreign policy of the U.S. and our actions around the world, and rightfully you can be, in many ways you should be justified, but it's important to understand the context, so we don't make those same mistakes. We don't want to make the same, missteps, but we also don't want to invite ourselves, upon more attacks on our country. So I can't emphasize enough how important this whole series is. And it's just so common for something as time, separates us from the event. We become a little desensitized and we don't have the same emotions we do. But you really need to feel that kick in the stomach every time. These people wanted to inflict pain on us, and it's important to not become consumed by that pain, but to feel it, recognize it, process it, and make the logical, rational steps forward that we need to do together as a united country, because it was very heartening to see the country united after that time, unfortunately for very awful circumstances. But we've lost a lot of that unity, and it's kind of crucial to move forward on a lot of policies that affect all of us.
Yeah. Well, let's end it there, because the last thing I'm going to announce, and I'm not going to say a name and I'm not going to say a position, but Mike, you worked hard and you secured a very prestigious guest for us on this series, and he'll be featured on the 3rd episode. And let's just put it this way. He was with the president on the day of the attacks in a very high-level position. So it will be unbelievably interesting to hear his perspective, and most importantly, the involvement in the intelligence apparatus that he had in some of the changes that they underwent and that he lived through or implemented himself. Hint, hint. So very cool, very awesome. I'm definitely petrified, but I do think that we've installed these systems like the ODNI and the different collaboration between the agencies. So I'm really grateful, Mike. Thank you again. I can't wait to do this again. And this has been Elevated Thoughts. We have a special guest. We brought on our colleague, Spencer Schecht.
Growing up in New York, it really represented so much. And you could say I grew up in the shadows of the towers, which was violently, suddenly interrupted. And then we all grew up in the shadow of 9/11. And there's still outstanding questions that we ought to still be outraged by and still be asking today. Why is it that the CIA broke protocol? These are still things that should be addressed today, and I think is important for Americans in 2024 and beyond to take seriously.